The wind had a voice that day. Not the kind that howled with violence, but the soft, aching kind, like a lullaby for the forgotten. In the sleepy town of Snowpine Valley, Montana, winter didn't ask permission. It simply settled in, curling its icy fingers around the pine-covered hills and wrapping the world in silence. At the edge of the valley, tucked behind a thicket of birch trees and a gravel road few locals remembered, stood the Snowpine Wildlife Rehabilitation Center. The building wasn't much to look at, just weathered wood, patched windows, and a roof that always leaked by mid-December. But inside, it carried something special, the last bit of hope for creatures no one else had room for. That morning, the old generator buzzed, casting dim yellow light across the main exam room. The walls bore the smell of iodine and pine cleaner. A half-finished cup of coffee steamed quietly on the counter, untouched. In the far corner, resting on a faded wool blanket inside a steel kennel, was Asher, a once proud yellow Labrador retriever. His coat, once the color of fresh hay, was now graying and thin. His ribs peeked through, and his breath came slow and shallow. He didn't lift his head anymore, not even for the sound of footsteps. The life in him flickered like a candle almost out of wax. Dr. Harold Warren, a man built of mountain winters and long days, stood quietly by Asher's side. He rubbed the bridge of his nose with tired fingers. His plaid shirt was tucked into worn jeans, sleeves rolled past the elbow. His boots, scuffed from years of walking these same floors, stood still. "We've tried everything, Maya," he said without turning. "Fluids. Antiparasitics. Full panels. 3 weeks of observation. There's nothing left." Behind him, Maya Thompson, the center's youngest intern, looked at Asher with knitted brows. She was sharp, hopeful. "But this kind of sorrow, you couldn't learn in school." "You think it's time?" she asked, voice soft as falling snow. Dr. Warren nodded, slow. "It's not about giving up. It's about mercy. He's in pain." Silence fell again, broken only by the faint click of a heating vent. Somewhere outside, a crow called through the trees. Inside, time stood still. The paperwork was already on the table. Just one signature away from ending Asher's suffering. Maya turned back to the dog. "He was a rescue, right? Came in last year? Found limping on the highway?" Dr. Warren sighed. "Yeah. Belonged to an old veteran who passed. Neighbors brought him in. Loyal to the end." The clock ticked. Outside, snow had started to fall, just a whisper at first. Inside, a man readied himself to say goodbye to a life that still lingered, barely. What no one knew then, not Dr. Warren, not Maya, not even Asher, was that a storm far greater than snow was coming. And with it, someone who wasn't ready to let go. Not yet. Not like this. The pen hovered over the signature line like a final nail above a resting coffin. Dr. Warren hesitated, not because he doubted the decision, but because after 30 years in animal care, this part never got easier. He'd once told Maya, half jokingly, "You build a wall around your heart or you won't last a year in this job." But some animals, some got through anyway. Asher had that way about him. Quiet, noble, watchful. The kind of dog who didn't need to bark to be heard. Even in sickness, there was a weight to his gaze, like he remembered things no one else did. And just as the doctor exhaled to finally write his name, the door burst open. It wasn't a gentle knock or the cautious creak of someone unsure. It was a force, cold air rushing in with it, sending the scent of snow and pine needles across the sterile room. Dr. Warren looked up, startled, as a voice rang out. "Don't do it. Please." A girl stood in the doorway, 17, maybe younger, with wind-blown curls tucked under a knit beanie. Her coat was 2 sizes too big, army green and frayed at the sleeves. A backpack hung off one shoulder, patches sewn across it like memories that refused to fade. Her cheeks were red from the cold, but her eyes, deep brown, sharp, determined, burned with something fiercer than winter. "I need to see the dog," she said, already stepping inside. Dr. Warren bristled. "Miss, this is a private facility." "I know," she cut in. "But his name's Asher. And I know what's wrong with him." Maya stepped forward, cautious. "We've already run full diagnostics. He's beyond help." "You ran the wrong tests," the girl said simply. Dr. Warren crossed his arms. "And who exactly are you?" She straightened her shoulders, as if bracing for impact. "Riley Morgan. My mom was Dr. Elaine Morgan. She worked with the Northern Wildlife Corps. She passed last year." The name hit Maya like a jolt. "Your mom was Elaine Morgan? The biologist who studied deep forest parasites?" Riley nodded and unzipped her backpack. Inside was a worn leather journal, pages dog-eared, corners fraying. She opened to a section marked with sticky notes and held it out. She discovered a parasite, rare, undetectable with standard labs. Attaches to the central nervous system, mimics neurological decay. She believed dogs, especially older ones, could be silent carriers. Dr. Warren squinted at the hand-drawn diagrams and scrawled notes. "This is advanced. But it's all theory." "It was," Riley said quietly. "But she made a serum before she died. And I brought it." From her pocket, she pulled a small vial filled with amber-colored liquid. "I know how this sounds," she added, voice trembling slightly. "But if you put him down now, he'll die for nothing." Silence swelled in the room again. Then, for the first time in days, Asher stirred. Just a twitch. His paw, barely. But it was enough. Dr. Warren didn't speak right away. But slowly, he set the pen down. And nodded. "5 minutes," he said. "Convince me." Riley took a slow, steady breath as she knelt beside the kennel, the cold metal bars pressing faint indentations into her knees. Everything around her seemed to blur, the hum of the fluorescent lights, the muffled rustle of snow-laden branches outside, even Maya's cautious footsteps behind her. All she could see was the dog. Asher. He was curled tight, like a bundle of fading light. His fur looked dull, almost gray under the artificial lighting. His chest rose and fell in shallow rhythm, his head limp against the blanket. But his eyes, they fluttered open at her presence. And then he did something that stopped the breath in Riley's lungs. He looked at her. Not through her, not past her. At her. Just for a second. But in that second, there was recognition, like a thread connecting two beings who had never met but somehow remembered each other. Maya saw it too. Did he just move? Riley didn't answer. She was already setting the notebook down and inching closer. Her hand reached through the bars, slowly, deliberately, and hovered inches above Asher's head. "You don't know me," she whispered, her voice low, soft, as though speaking to a baby or a ghost. "But I think you knew my mom. Or maybe something inside you did." Her fingers brushed his ear. No growl. No flinch. Just the gentle contact of skin to fur, and Asher's body easing beneath it. A trembling exhale left his muzzle. Riley felt it through her palm like a breath of trust. Dr. Warren, arms crossed from across the room, shifted slightly. His voice carried a note of warning, but also of awe. That dog hasn't responded to touch in over a week. Riley nodded, never taking her eyes off Asher. That's because you've been treating the wrong thing. She reached into her backpack again and retrieved a photocopied page from her mother's journal. It showed a crude but meticulous sketch of a Labrador's nervous system, with small dark spots marked along the spinal cord. These parasites, she said, pointing, hide in the brainstem. They trigger muscle weakness, confusion, even what looks like seizure activity. But it's not degeneration. It's invasion. Maya leaned closer, curiosity lighting behind her glasses. We ran full blood panels. Nothing flagged. Because it doesn't show up in blood, Riley replied gently. Only in the cerebrospinal fluid. And even then, only during neural excitation. Dr. Warren remained skeptical, but something about Riley's calm certainty, the way she moved, the way Asher let her touch him, cracked the wall he'd spent years building. Even if what you're saying is true, he began, voice low, this is still untested. Experimental. Unapproved. I know, Riley said, finally meeting his gaze. But he's dying anyway. If we do nothing, he's gone. But if I'm right, we change everything. She held up the amber vial, light catching the glass like a glimmer of something sacred. This isn't just about saving him, she said. It's about finishing what my mom started. Asher stirred again, pressing his nose lightly to her hand. A choice hung in the air. And somehow, even before the serum touched his blood, the healing had already begun. The room had fallen into a silence so complete, even the low hum of the overhead lights seemed to hold its breath. Riley crouched beside Asher's kennel, the vial of amber serum now drawn into a sterile syringe. Her hands, though steady in appearance, trembled faintly beneath the surface, not from fear, but from the unbearable weight of hope. Dr. Warren watched with narrowed eyes, the corner of his jaw twitching. He had spent decades in animal medicine. He'd seen Hail Mary attempts. He'd watched desperate owners hang on when they should have let go. But he had also seen miracles. What was happening here, this girl, this moment, felt awfully close to one. Back of the neck, Riley murmured to herself, drawing in a deep breath. Loose skin. Slow and steady. She slid open the kennel door just enough to reach inside. Asher didn't resist. He didn't growl. He simply leaned into her hand, as if something in him recognized that this wasn't the end after all. Maya stood to the side, hands clasped over her chest. Do you need help? She asked gently. No, Riley said, voice hushed. I've got him. Her fingers parted the fur behind Asher's shoulders, finding the fold of skin that felt like memory. With practiced care, she inserted the needle. The serum glowed faintly in the light as it flowed into his bloodstream. Then came the waiting. At first, nothing happened. Asher remained still, chest rising slowly. His eyelids drooped. For a moment, Riley feared the worst. That it had been too late. That her mother's work was just ink and theory, and Asher was too far gone. Then his body jerked. Hard. Riley gasped and withdrew her hand as Asher convulsed, his legs twitching, claws scraping softly against the kennel floor. His back arched, and a deep, guttural whimper escaped his throat. It wasn't a bark. It wasn't even pain. It was something older. Something primal. What's happening? Maya cried out, moving closer. Seizure activity, Dr. Warren said sharply, stepping forward. His system's reacting. Could be neurotoxic. No, Riley said firmly. It's the parasite. It's fighting back. Asher's body convulsed again, then stilled. Riley's heart stopped with him. For 3 seconds, 4, maybe 5, the world stopped spinning. The room stood frozen in that breathless place between life and death. Then, slowly, his chest rose. A long, deep inhale. Then another. And another. Maya clapped a hand to her mouth. He's breathing. Normally. Dr. Warren knelt beside the kennel, placed 2 fingers against Asher's ribs, his expression unreadable. Pulse is stabilizing, he said, almost to himself. Respiration, improving. He's not crashing. Riley didn't speak. She just let the tears come. Asher, still weak, blinked slowly. And for the first time in weeks, his eyes were clear, a warm amber, free of fog. "Welcome back," she whispered. The serum had worked. Her mother had been right. But deep inside, beneath the relief, a question stirred. If Asher had been infected, how many others were out there? The fire crackled softly in the old stone stove, casting flickering shadows across the rehab center's wooden walls. Outside, snow continued its quiet descent, blanketing the Montana wilderness in a stillness that felt almost holy. But inside the exam room, no one was at peace. Riley sat cross-legged beside Asher's kennel, her back resting against the wall. She hadn't moved in hours. Her army jacket had become a blanket draped over her knees, her curls now falling messily over tired eyes. In front of her, Asher lay curled on his side, no longer motionless, no longer lost. He was breathing strong. When she had arrived, he was slipping away. Now, he had eaten a few bites of chicken broth. He had even wagged his tail, just once. But once was enough. Across the room, Maya scribbled vitals into a worn clipboard, her brow furrowed with a mixture of disbelief and scientific curiosity. Every time she looked at Asher, it was like seeing a ghost brought back from the edge. Dr. Warren stood near the window, arms crossed, staring out into the pines. His voice, when it came, was low and careful. "If that parasite was real, and clearly it is, then we've got a bigger problem on our hands." Riley didn't look up. "I know. We thought it was neurodegenerative disease," Maya added, stepping closer. "But if this thing's misdiagnosing animals..." "It's spreading," Riley finished, her voice steady. "And it's doing it quietly." Dr. Warren turned from the window, fixing his eyes on Riley. "Tell me everything your mother knew." Riley nodded, pulling her backpack into her lap. She flipped through her mother's leather-bound journal, its pages smudged with ink and age. She found the section marked in red. "She called it CNSR3, Riley explained. Central Nervous System Reactive Parasite, Type 3. Extremely adaptive. It mimics late-stage neurological failure. That's why standard panels miss it. It only becomes detectable when the host is close to collapse." Maya's face paled. "So every animal that's been put down for unexplained symptoms could have been infected." Riley nodded grimly. Dr. Warren exhaled. "God help us." Just then, the hallway door creaked open. A gust of cold air followed, and with it came the scent of pine and something else, fear. It was one of the other interns, Tyler. His face was pale, breath coming fast. "There's something in the woods," he said. "About a quarter mile out. I saw it near the tree line. Looked like a coyote. Sick. Real bad." Riley's heart skipped. Dr. Warren didn't wait. "Gear up," he said. "Tranquilizers. Thermal scanner. Bring the med kit." Maya grabbed the scanner off the counter, slinging it over her shoulder. "You coming?" she asked Riley. Riley looked at Asher. He opened his eyes, clear, alert, and met her gaze. "I'm coming," she said. She stood, tucked her mother's journal under her arm, and followed them into the dark. They had saved one life. But the forest was calling. And it wasn't done with them yet. The snow crunched under their boots, muffled and rhythmic, as they made their way into the trees. Even by Montana standards, Snowpine Forest was remote, ancient pines that towered like silent witnesses, their dark trunks dusted white, and the kind of quiet that made you feel like you'd stepped out of time. The deeper they walked, the more the sounds of the clinic fell away, replaced by the whisper of wind and the occasional groan of bending branches. Riley walked in the middle, flanked by Maya and Dr. Warren. She held her mother's journal close to her chest beneath her jacket. The scanner in Maya's hands blinked softly, sweeping the landscape with invisible pulses of heat. "Still think we're chasing ghosts?" Maya asked, not sarcastically, but with a trace of hope that maybe, just maybe, they were wrong. "No," Dr. Warren said flatly. "We've already seen one come back from the dead." Riley didn't speak. She was listening. And then, through the stillness, a sound reached them, soft but unmistakable. A low whimper. Dry, scratchy. Like something trying to cry with a throat full of sand. Riley raised a hand. They stopped. Maya pointed the scanner toward the sound. The screen pulsed once, twice, then lit up in red. "There," she whispered. "Heat signature. Small. Coyote-sized. 50 yards." They moved forward cautiously. Through the trees, curled beside a fallen log and half covered in frost, lay a coyote. At first glance, it might have looked dead, but then it shifted, barely. Its fur was patchy, matted with ice and dirt. Its ribs jutted out beneath the skin like sharp stones. Most telling of all were the eyes, milky, disoriented, and glassy, just like Asher's had been. "Oh God," Maya breathed. "It's the same parasite." Riley crouched low, voice calm. "Let's not spook it." "Maya, prep the sedative." Maya ready to tranquilize her dart, loading it into the air rifle with practiced hands. "Aim for the flank, right?" Riley nodded. "Just enough to calm it. We need to keep it alive." The dart struck with a soft thwick. The coyote jerked, let out a weak yelp, then slumped. They rushed forward. Riley placed a gentle hand on its side. It was still breathing, shallow but steady. Up close, she could see the tremors in its muscles, the way its skin twitched involuntarily. "It's already deep in the nervous system," she said. "Just like Mom wrote." Maya fastened a tracking collar around the animal's neck. "We'll need to monitor it. See where it's been. Where it might have picked this up." But then, a twig snapped, clear and sharp. They froze. Riley stood slowly, eyes scanning the shadows. Something moved. Then the scanner lit up again. "Multiple signatures," Maya whispered, voice shaking. "All red." From the dark, more shapes emerged. Eyes glowing. Movements jerky. Limbs stiff. One thing was suddenly, horribly clear. This wasn't an isolated infection. It was the beginning of an outbreak. There are silences in the wilderness that feel natural, like the world has paused to let the snow fall, or to let the wind find its way through the trees. But this silence was different. It was heavy. Loaded. Like the forest itself was bracing for what came next. Riley's breath caught in her throat as she turned toward the shadows beyond the fallen log. The trees stood motionless, their dark trunks rising like cathedral pillars around them. But between them, shapes flickered. Unnatural shapes. Movement without rhythm. Limbs moving against instinct, stiff and unsure. Maya stared at the scanner, her face pale. 5 heat signatures. All infected. They're circling. Dr. Warren stepped closer to Riley, eyes narrowed. Stay close. If we have to run. He didn't finish the sentence. Because then, the trees broke. There was no warning, no roar, no crash, just a sudden, terrifying presence bursting through the pine boughs. It was a bear. Or at least, it used to be. Its fur was matted with black patches, parts of it missing entirely, revealing skin warped and swollen like boiled leather. Its muscles rippled unnaturally beneath the surface, twitching in spasms, as if its body were being controlled by something fighting against it. Its eyes, blank. White. Completely consumed. Riley gasped. That's not sickness. That's possession. The bear reared back on its hind legs, a distorted sound rumbling from deep in its throat, a guttural, gurgling bellow that sounded like it came from two throats at once. Then it charged. Move! Dr. Warren shouted, shoving Riley and Maya toward the clearing. The coyote, the one they had just tranquilized, suddenly sprang to life, staggering to its feet. It let out a sharp bark and took off into the trees, weaving through the snow like a scout. Riley didn't have time to think about how or why. She followed. Branches slapped her face. Her boots slipped on the packed snow, adrenaline pulling her forward as the ground thundered behind her. She could hear the bear's breath now, ragged, wet, angry. Maya stumbled ahead of her, clutching the scanner tight. There's a drop, up ahead, toward the river. Riley's chest burned. We'll never outrun it. A second roar tore through the trees, closer now. The ground vibrated with its steps. Dr. Warren fired a tranquilizer dart, a direct hit to the shoulder, but the bear barely flinched. We jump! Maya shouted. Riley looked up just in time to see the world fall away. The trees gave way to a steep slope, 30 feet down to the riverbank. Icy water surged below, carving through the land like a silver blade. There was no time to argue. With one last look behind her, at the infected giant bearing down, Riley grabbed Maya's hand. And they jumped. The cold hit like stone. The roar of the bear faded behind them, drowned out by the deafening rush of water. They were underwater now, caught in the current, spiraling deeper into the unknown. And the forest, infected, awakening, was far from finished. The river took them. It was not the kind of water that welcomed you. It dragged, pulled, tossed like an angry hand in the dark. Riley fought to surface, her arms flailing against the icy current, lungs burning with the panic of drowning. Somewhere ahead, she caught sight of Maya, a blur of motion, gasping just above the waterline. Then, solid ground. Riley's knees slammed into river rocks as she clawed toward the edge, coughing, choking on freezing air. Maya collapsed beside her, eyes wide, teeth chattering, but alive. The river surged on behind them, indifferent. They'd landed in a narrow inlet, a little bend in the bank half hidden by a wall of boulders and hanging roots. Behind them rose a dark opening, a cave, yawning like a mouth carved from stone, half obscured by hanging moss and snow-dusted vines. Are you okay? Riley gasped, still catching her breath. Maya nodded shakily. I think so. That bear, that thing, did it follow? Riley listened. Nothing but the river's roar behind them. No crashing. No movement in the trees. I think we lost it, she said, though she wasn't sure. They turned toward the cave. It wasn't shelter, they hadn't chosen it, but it was their only refuge from the cold and the infected wilderness behind them. Riley stood first. As she stepped into the cave, the air shifted. Warmer. Too warm. The darkness inside wasn't empty, it felt thick. Alive. "Something's not right," Maya whispered. They edged in, flashlight beams cutting through the gloom. What they saw stopped them cold. The cave walls were covered in black, pulsing veins, like roots crawling through rock. They glowed faintly, rhythmic and slow, a heartbeat, deep and unnatural. The floor beneath their boots was slick with moisture, and the farther they went, the more the air smelled wrong, sweet, rotting, metallic. "This is where it started," Riley murmured, stunned. "This isn't a natural infection. It's a nest." Maya swallowed hard, her voice barely above a whisper. "You mean like ground zero?" Riley nodded. As they moved deeper, the tunnel opened into a vast underground chamber. At its center stood something massive, a cocoon, suspended in a web of black tendrils, its surface throbbing slowly, like something inside was breathing. Maya stepped back instinctively. "What is that?" Riley's voice was hollow. "Not a parasite. Not just an organism. It's something sentient." The cocoon twitched. Maya yelped, grabbing Riley's arm. Then came the sound, a low, wet clicking, like bones cracking underwater. Riley's flashlight beam caught a hand peeling away from the cocoon's outer membrane. Not an animal's hand. A human-shaped one. Riley's heart slammed against her ribs. "This isn't just an infection," she said, breathless. "It's a being. And it's waking up." The cave trembled. Above them, the forest lay quiet. But below the earth, something ancient had been stirred, and it wasn't alone. The cocoon peeled open with the slow, deliberate motion of something long dormant and deeply unnatural. From within, the form began to emerge, not crawling, not stumbling, but unfolding, as if every bone and sinew had been waiting for the right moment to breathe. Its body was tall, unnaturally thin, its limbs elongated, joints bending just a little too far in the wrong directions. Its skin shimmered with a translucent sheen, like thin ice over black water, and underneath, something seemed to writhe, liquid and alive. It had no eyes. Only smooth, pale skin stretched across its face, and yet Riley could feel it watching her, intimately, unblinkingly. The air grew heavier with each passing second. Maya stood frozen, her hands still clutched around the scanner that now flickered with every possible warning. The screen pulsed red. The creature was emitting the same signal as the infected animals, but stronger. Focused. Riley's breath trembled in her throat. It stepped forward. Not aggressively, but curiously, as if relearning how to use its legs. Its head tilted, movements jerky but thoughtful. Then it stopped. And the clicking began again. It wasn't random. It was communication. Riley took a slow step back. Maya whispered, "Should we run?" But Riley didn't answer. Because something else was happening in her mind. A voice. Not a sound. A feeling, pressed into thought, as clear as memory. Home. It wasn't speaking with words. It was sharing a truth, a longing. Riley's knees weakened under the weight of it. A planet filled with light and forest, rivers that glowed blue, skies wrapped in gold, and then fire. Destruction. A ship tearing through space in desperation, seeking somewhere, anywhere, it could land. She gasped. The creature wasn't a monster. It was a refugee. Maya stepped closer, eyes wide with horror and wonder. "Riley, did you hear that?" Riley nodded, barely able to speak. "It's not trying to take over," she whispered. "It's trying to survive." Behind them, the cocoon pulsed again, and the creature stood still, waiting, not attacking. There was no rage in it. Only a plea. And for the first time since this began, Riley saw the truth. This wasn't an invasion. It was a cry for help. The chamber trembled with a low, pulsing hum, as if the earth itself were trying to hold its breath. The creature stood before them, still, watchful, not advancing. Its body shimmered faintly in the low light, veins of dark liquid shifting beneath its translucent skin. Every instinct in Riley screamed to run, to hide, to raise the tranquilizer gun still strapped to her belt. But she didn't move. Because she had seen its memories. Felt its grief. Beneath all the fear and the strangeness, there was something unmistakably human in it, a desperation to belong. Behind her, Maya raised her voice in a shaky whisper. "We have to destroy it, right? This thing infected animals, turned that bear into a monster. We can't let it live." Riley turned to her slowly. "But what if we already did?" Maya blinked. "What? What if it didn't want to hurt them? What if this infection, it's just its biology trying to adapt? Like a plant growing in new soil." Riley's voice softened, trembling under the weight of the choice. "What if this is the only way it knows how to survive?" Maya looked at the creature, then back at Riley. "And what if it's lying?" The creature took a step back. A flicker of something passed across its strange, eyeless face. Fear. It didn't lunge. It didn't roar. It simply placed one long, clawed hand over its chest, the same gesture Riley had seen in the vision, and bowed its head. And again, in her mind, she heard it. "Home." Riley lowered her gun. "We came here to find a cure," she said, her voice low but clear. "But maybe the cure isn't to kill it. Maybe it's to understand it." Maya's eyes welled with tears, not fear this time, but the unbearable weight of possibility. In that moment, the choice was made. Not by a government, not by a lab, not by fear. But by a 17-year-old girl in a cave under Montana who decided to listen. And the creature stayed still. Not as a conqueror, but as a guest. Waiting to be heard. The snow was falling again when they returned. Not the harsh, wind-driven kind that slices through your coat, but the soft, steady kind, like the world was trying to start over, covering everything with a fresh sheet of quiet. Riley stepped out of the truck first, her boots crunching in the new powder. Her curls were damp, her coat torn at the sleeve, and her legs ached from the run, the fall, the river. But her eyes were clear. Steady. Older than they'd been just 2 days ago. Maya followed close behind, cradling the metal case of samples in her arms, blood, tissue, fluid. Evidence of what they'd seen. What they now knew. The case was locked tight, but the truth inside felt fragile, like it might break with one wrong word. Dr. Warren was already waiting at the clinic door. He hadn't slept. Hadn't left. The porch light glowed behind him, casting his tired face in amber and shadow. When he saw them alive, something unspoken softened in his expression. "You look like hell," he said, his voice rough but warm. "You should see the other guy," Riley replied. There was a pause, one of those old, quiet pauses where people hold their words because nothing seems big enough for what they've just been through. Then Riley reached into her coat pocket and held out a single vial, one more dose of the amber serum, sealed, intact. "We saw where it came from," she said simply. "It's not what we thought." Dr. Warren took the vial gently, but didn't ask questions, not yet. He simply nodded and stepped aside, letting them in. Inside, the warmth of the rehab center felt almost foreign. Familiar walls. The scent of pine disinfectant. The faint hum of the old heater working overtime. And in the corner, lying on a fresh blanket, Asher lifted his head. His eyes were clear now. He stood slowly, walked to Riley's side, and pressed his muzzle into her palm. She closed her eyes, just for a second, letting that quiet moment anchor her. They had returned from something unthinkable. But they weren't broken. They were witnesses now. And the real question wasn't what had happened beneath the earth. It was what the world would do when it finally learned the truth. A week had passed, but it felt like years. The snow had melted in patches, revealing damp earth and faded pine needles along the old walking trail behind the clinic. The forest looked the same, stoic, vast, untouched, but Riley knew better now. She walked slowly, one hand tucked in her coat pocket, the other holding a leash gently coiled around her fingers. Asher trotted beside her, tail swaying, ears perked, nose twitching at every breeze. He looked nothing like the skeletal shell she had first seen. His coat was fuller, his gait steady, his eyes bright with something that could only be called peace. If someone saw him now, they'd never believe how close he'd come to death. But Riley remembered. They reached the edge of the clearing, a quiet space where the trees opened up to a view of the valley. Mountains rolled across the horizon, snow-dusted and strong. The sky above was pale blue, a quiet kind of hopeful. Riley crouched beside Asher, letting her fingers run through his warm fur. "My mom used to bring me here," she said softly, almost to herself. Said this was her thinking spot. She believed everything in nature had a language, you just had to sit still long enough to hear it. Asher sat, ears tilting toward the woods. Riley looked out over the trees. Somewhere beneath them, in the earth below, was that creature, those memories. That life. Maya and Dr. Warren had decided not to report everything. Not yet. The world wasn't ready for words like alien and sentient parasite delivered without evidence people could hold in their hands. For now, it was classified as an unknown infection with rare survivability. But Riley knew the truth. She had seen it. And maybe, just maybe, there was a reason that truth had come to her, not to scientists in a lab or men in suits, but to a girl carrying her mother's journal and her own stubborn faith that life, in any form, was worth saving. She stood, brushing snow from her coat. "We're not done yet, boy," she said, smiling down at Asher. "We've got more listening to do." Asher barked once, clear, strong, alive. And together, they turned back toward the forest. Not to fight, but to understand. To learn. And to carry forward the lesson her mother had always known. Sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is choose compassion. End of script.